Hi, and thanks for coming. I wanted to talk today about the changes, I would argue, collapse of journalism, something that I witnessed over the trajectory of my own career, and something I have experienced as a reporter. I spent 15 years with the New York Times, was a freelance reporter before that, worked for the Dallas Morning News, worked for National Public Radio. But I want to go back to when I was in high school, which was in the 1970s. 1971, you had the release of the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg. An important distinction that is lost on a lot of people. I'm, of course, a strong supporter of Julian Assange. Is that Ellsberg actually took the papers, the classified documents himself, unlike Julian, and then got them published in the New York Times and other newspapers. You had Watergate, the investigation into Richard Nixon's administration, which was bugging, tapping, and in burglarizing the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate. So this was perhaps a moment when the American press was ascendant. It's something that inspired journalists such as myself, or people who wanted to go into journalism. I think it's important to realize, as I did, especially reading Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, that there were always severe limitations to journalism. I mean, for example, the reason that Watergate was covered as extensively as it was in the press and saw eventually the impeachment of Richard Nixon is not because those tactics were being employed by the administration. They've been employed for years against anti-war activists, the Black Power movement, we know from COINTELPRO, but because at that point Nixon used them against competing centers of the power elite, and that was a line that couldn't be crossed. So I went into journalism as a freelance reporter. I developed a close friendship I was at Harvard with Robert Cox. He had been the editor of the Buenos Aires Herald during the dirty war in Argentina. This was when the military government in Argentina disappeared 30,000 of its own citizens, and he was alone in printing on the front page of his newspaper the names of the desaparecidos from the day before. This eventually led to Bob being seized by the Falconeros, so these kind of Argentine death squads run by the security forces. And he is a British citizen, and the British government intervened, which is, I'm certain, the only reason he's alive today. But that was a very important relationship for me. I developed a close friendship. He was on a fellowship at Harvard at the time. And that was the kind of journalism I wanted to do. I wanted to give a voice to those the rest of society, or the dominant culture, was seeking to silence. I wanted to report on fascist or proto-fascist governments. We had, of course, Pinochet in Chile. I went and studied Spanish at the Marinol Institute in Cochabamba, Bolivia. And actually, while I was living in Cochabamba, Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, was living in Cochabamba, going by the name Klaus Altmann, but we all knew who he was, responsible for ran the SS in Lyon, tortured and killed the leader of the French resistance, Jean Moulin. I used to see Barbie seated down in the Prado with his bodyguards and think that is the man who personally killed Jean Moulin. He was eventually extradited to France and died in prison. But these governments, the Argentine government, of course, a safe haven for former Nazis, Pinochet, all had very overt links to these fascists and fascist ideology. When I left for my year to study Spanish, Bob told me I should take the collected letters, essays, and journalism of George Orwell, which I did. Orwell remains my kind of secular Bible. Orwell himself, of course, went to Spain to fight against the fascists, was shot through the neck and nearly killed, and then wrote his masterpiece, Homage to Catalonia, which I think sold about 600 copies in his lifetime. So this was all my formation. I would also have to add my father, although he was not a journalist, he was a minister and a social activist. That was what journalism was for me and remains for me. I remember I went to a boarding school as a scholarship student, and the censorship by the faculty advisors who ran the school newspaper led me to found an underground newspaper. But it was a very wealthy boarding school. The Rockefellers had gone there, and awash in money. And the people who, the cooks and the pot washers in the kitchen lived above the kitchen, and no student was allowed to go there. But I, of course, crept up there anyway, and it was appalling. It was the paint was coming off the walls, and these cots with stained mattresses and bare light bulbs. So I took pictures and wrote a story about it, and then waited for the commencement issue and distributed it to shame the administration into providing adequate living facilities, which of course they did, although they ended up banning my newspaper. And when I came back the next year, the pot washers had put a little plaque up on the wall in my memory. That was a very moving moment, remains moving to this day. That's what journalism should be. And so I began as a freelancer. I went to El Salvador to cover the war for the Christian Science Monitor, National Public Radio. And this was at a time when the death squads were killing 700 to 1,000 people a month. Very dangerous. 22 reporters were killed in that conflict. And we were fiercely attacked by the Reagan administration, who sought to discredit our reportings of atrocities that were carried out routinely by the Salvadoran. I also covered Guatemala by Rios Montt and the Contras in Nicaragua. And there were, pretty serious attempts and pressure on our news organizations to remove us. It was a good lesson. I would end up spending 7 years in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, and of course got the full frontal assault of AIPAC and the Israel lobby, which is vicious. But it was a period, I think, in journalism where we could confront centers of power, and that confrontation relied heavily on the cooperation of people within the mechanisms of power who would give us information, and not only information, but often documents. So very early on, I published classified material. I would go on and publish classified material in the New York Times. The publication of this material, especially when I worked for the New York Times, engendered a response. Usually the next day, there would have to be press conferences about what had been published. Certainly at the State Department, I was overseas, of course. And I had a good friend, Sidney Schanberg. Ever saw the movie The Killing Fields? It's based on his relationship with Dith Pran, who was also a friend. And Sidney, who was pushed out of the New York Times, as I think a lot of good reporters finally who are management headaches. This isn't uncommon. The New York Times, like any The Guardian or anywhere else, is a careerist, it's a corporate careerist organization. And you have two types of reporters: those who pay fealty to their careers, and those that attempt to pay fealty to the truth. But they often run afoul of the machinery, as Sidney did. He came back from Cambodia and was made the Metro bureau chief, and he saw that these rapacious developers were seizing up everything in Manhattan and destroying rent control and essentially driving the working class out of Manhattan, gentrification, which of course is true in London and everywhere else. And he went after these people. Well, of course, they were all friends of the publisher. So Sidney was pushed out of the paper, ended up at the Village Voice. But I remember Sidney saying to me, looking back on his own career, he said, well, we may have not made things better, but perhaps we stopped things from getting worse. And I think that's probably a fair analysis of what we were able to do. We were able to make incremental changes. I would go on and cover the war in Bosnia. I was in Sarajevo, daily shelling and sniper fire by the Bosnian Serb forces, 4 to 5 dead a day, 300 shells a day, 24 wounded a day, 45 journalists had been killed by the time I got there in 1995. So it didn't stop the slaughter, but it eventually, uh, uh, I think, drip by drip, story by story, especially after Srebrenica, forced the international community to act. Um, Everything began to change radically, uh, and I want to talk about these two changes. First of all, with the rise of the internet and cable, and we can't discount the importance of Fox News, the rise of clearly partisan, vitriolic cable channels, and ultimately internet, Breitbart, and other publications that did no longer attempted to traffic in truth. And let me just go back and talk about the sins of the commercial media, which I was part of. The job of a journalist is to manipulate facts. So we select facts for a story, and then we piece those facts together to present a narrative. Now, a good careerist is going to take those facts and not anger the powerful, either within their news organization or within the society. A good journalist will take those facts and use them to attempt to convey the truth. But there was always a constant tension, even within newsrooms. So I would be reporting one reality on the ground in El Salvador, and all the reporters in the Washington bureau who are having lunch with Reagan administration officials and made their living off of being leaked information that was beneficial, of course, to the powerful, oftentimes were at odds with those of us who are on the ground. And the way that a paper like the New York Times would deal with this would be to print their story out of Washington, which I can tell you, having been there, was largely false, next to my story, which was out of some small town in El Salvador, where the Salvadoran military had probably gunned down a bunch of innocent civilians. And that would be done in the name of balance. You also have heavy pressure put on publishers and senior editors when reporters become problematic, such as myself or Ray Bonner, or there are a bunch of us, and they often are very successful in getting you removed from the story. But going back to that first change within journalism. So the rise of Fox, the rise of the internet, created a different model for journalism. It used to be that you had major conglomerates, CBS, NBC, ABC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times in London, El País, Der Spiegel, and they dominated the media landscape to such an extent that there really were no real competitors. And so the model was to reach the broadest number of people. And that is where you got this kind of faux objectivity and faux neutrality, which is a fiction, of course. But with the rise of the internet, with the rise of cable, that all broke down. And you started having multiple media centers. And the model changed for all of the media, including the mainstream media. And instead of attempting to reach a broad group of people, or as wide an audience as possible, you started catering to a particular demographic. So MSNBC, I can't remember the exact figures, 94% or something, identify as registered Democrats. So roughly the same is true for NPR, the New York Times. And the inverse is true with Fox, where the vast majority identify as Republicans. But you've siloed demographics. This was something, by the way, that I saw in Yugoslavia, where you had competing ethnic groups seize media centers and cater to that ethnicity, whether they were Croat, Muslim, or Serb. And what comes with that catering to that particular demographic is the demonization of the opposing demographic. That was certainly true in Yugoslavia, but it's very true in the media landscape in the United States and much of Europe now. And so you're feeding back to that demographic what it is they want to hear. At the same time, you're demonizing the opposing demographic and creating this climate of fear, a very dangerous climate. So, for instance, if you are part of the right wing, then you fear that liberals are uh, going to create socialism and allow homosexuals to teach in your schools and let your daughters have abortions and whatever else. And of course, empower minorities, in particular Black people. And if you are on the Democratic side of the equation, then you believe, which is equally fictitious. So there's no monopoly on fake news here, that the reason Donald Trump was elected was because of Vladimir Putin, which is patently ridiculous. The reason Donald Trump was elected was because the Democratic Party and the Democratic elite sold out the working class, particularly under Bill Clinton. And Trump spoke to that rage in a very crude and vulgar way, which of course only excited his base even more. So we saw the media landscape itself splinter and fragment into these siloed activities, and that created, again, going back to Yugoslavia, a situation where the more antagonistic these media centers become, the less able a society is to communicate. The communication breaks down. And I think that's certainly where we are in the United States. So people exist in one reality, which is largely invented on one side, and people exist in another reality, largely invented on the other side. And both sides ratchet up the fear of the other. So that was the first important development in terms of the shattering of the media landscape. We should also note that with the rise of the internet revenue streams, especially for newsprint, declined dramatically. 40% of newspaper revenue streams came from classified advertising. That vanished with things like Craigslist. So that's almost 50% of their income. And then through the internet, the news organizations no longer had a monopoly on collecting sellers with buyers, because they have all of our profiles, digital profiles, and know all of our proclivities and medical records and everything else about us. Through the internet, you can target consumers directly. You don't need the press. So advertising plummeted. Major newspapers in cities, big cities in the United States, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, are a shell of what they had been when I began. Huge layoffs in newsrooms. I remember going in a couple years ago to the Philadelphia Inquirer. They used to have well over, I think, 1,200 reporters and editors, and they reduced their staff by 3/4. It was less than 200 people in the newsroom, and it was just seas of empty desks. And so with that financial assault, we saw news organizations become even more obsequious to advertisers, and because they don't want to lose them, we saw them slash whole departments, foreign departments, foreign bureaus. Used to be that many of these regional papers had foreign correspondents, including the Philadelphia Inquirer. That's all gone. They used to have foreign pages. That's all gone. And they cut their investigative teams. I was an investigative journalist for the Times. It's very labor intensive and very costly job. After 9/11, I was in Paris covering Al Qaeda in Europe and the Middle East. I only wrote 5 stories. It probably cost the paper several $100,000 to get those 5 stories. But those were the days and the fading days when those kinds of resources were put into investigative journalism. And unfortunately, investigative journalism has suffered tremendously. There's very little of it done. It is a skill. I worry that those skills, of course, are being lost. So you had this kind of an anemic quality to news organizations because of the financial assault. You had them bifurcated, fragmented, siloed because of the rise of the internet and cable. And then what we saw was wholesale surveillance. So with the rise of wholesale surveillance, it's very easy for the state to track down anyone within the centers of power who speaks to the press. This is why Edward Snowden, who I admire very much, of course, immediately fled the country. He knew that he would easily be found out for passing on these important files to Glenn Greenwald, and exposing the fact that we are the most spied upon, watched, monitored, photographed population in human history. And I covered the Stasi state in East Germany. So what we then saw was essentially a shutting down of any communication between those within the centers of power who had access to information that, because they have a conscience, were willing to tell the public about the crimes, the fraud, the lies that their government had carried out. This is why Julian is so important. So the real assault actually was carried out in the United States by Barack Obama. He used the 1917 Espionage Act. That was kind of the equivalent of the British Foreign Secrets Act, but what it does is it criminalizes anyone who has classified information and prosecutes them supposedly for giving that information to a hostile power. So from 1917 until the Obama administration, it was used, I think, 3 times against whistleblowers, including Ellsberg, although they threw the case out because, which they sort of same reason that they should throw the Assange case out, because of violations of the law in terms of like going in and seizing the records in Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. In Julian's case, you had the CIA through UC Global filming his meetings with his attorneys, eviscerating attorney-client privilege. That in the UK court, if we were going by the rule of law, or in a US court, would mean the prosecution of Julian was invalid. So what we saw was under the Obama administration, I think he used it 8 or 9 times, I can't remember the exact figure, against whistleblowers. Anyone who leaked to the press. John Kiriakou exposed the torture program by the CIA, used it against Snowden, of course. This was a misuse of the Espionage Act, but it sent tremendous chill within the centers of power. One, they knew they would be prosecuted and sent to prison. I just visited Daniel Hale, who's serving a 45-month prison sentence in Marion, Illinois, because he leaked information that exposed that the militarized drone program in the Middle East was killing up to 90% civilians. So one, they can find you because of wholesale surveillance. And number 2, they will use the Espionage Act to send you to prison. Now, the last readout, in essence, the last ability for us to shine a light onto the inner workings of power, because of the system that's now been set up through wholesale surveillance, the prosecution of whistleblowers, comes through those who are willing to hack or leak. So Chelsea Manning, although she had access, so I suppose it wasn't a hack, she had the passwords, but to get into a system, Jerry Hammond would be a good case, where he hacked into a security firm, Stratfor, and exposed some very important information, which I used. I sued Obama for his passage of Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. This lawsuit was carried out in 2012. Section 1021 of the what it does is it allows the U.S. government to deploy the military as a domestic police force in a time of emergency. That's something that is legally prohibited under the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act. And in my trial, which we won, actually, surprisingly, in the Southern District Court of New York, and then the Obama administration immediately, and they were made an appeal to lift the temporary injunction. And what they did is these courts, because it is a black and white legal issue, what they do is they deny your standing. So it went to the appellate court. In the U.S. system, in the federal system, it's the court, the appellate court, and then the Supreme Court. Went to the appellate court, and they wouldn't rule for months. And I had been part of the case against James Clapper, the head of intelligence, Amnesty International, Clapper versus Amnesty International. I was one of the plaintiffs, where we had, as journalists, sued the government for wholesale surveillance. And this was before Snowden. The federal lawyers actually got up in court and said that if any of us were being surveilled, the government would have informed us, a patent lie. The Supreme Court threw the case out and said we didn't have standing to bring the case. That's how they skirt the legal issue. And so the appellate court waited for the Supreme Court ruling and said, well, Hedges doesn't have standing in Hedges versus Obama. I mean, in Clapper versus Amnesty International. Therefore, he doesn't have standing in Hedges versus Obama. And so they don't actually hear it. We filed a petition known as a cert to the Supreme Court, and they didn't accept it. So it's law. But in that trial, because of Jeremy, we saw conversations, email conversations between security officials at Stratfor and Homeland Security, where they were going after dissidents and leftists. And the way they were doing it is searching for jihadist sites that might have picked up anything that these journalists had either said or written or produced, and then getting them under terrorism laws. So there was a hunt to essentially use the Espionage Act, use terrorism laws against people they considered dissidents. Jeremy spent 10 years in a prison for this. And so this created a situation within journalism that I find extremely ominous. It's why I'm such a strong supporter of Julian, who has practiced the most consequential and important journalism of our generation. The legal anomalies, I've sat in the court proceedings in London, and then during COVID would follow them online through video link. Just a travesty. It's judicial pantomime, as it's meant to be, and kind of Dickensian farce. Here's a man who never committed a crime, first of all, an Australian citizen. WikiLeaks is not a US-based publication being charged under the Espionage Act. The consequences, as I think many of you know, are quite dire in the sense that if Julian is extradited and convicted, then anyone who possesses classified material, any reporter who possesses classified material, as I did several times throughout my career, much less publishes that material, is criminalized. And that's, of course, the goal. The rise of social inequality, the rise of the corporate state means that the real investigations into power are aggressively being shut down. And unfortunately, they've become quite effective. So I have friends, for instance, who still work at the New York Times and do investigative journalism, and they're in utter despair. No one will speak to them within government because of the consequences. And what we have seen is this aggressive assault against people who have the skills to hack into systems and expose information, because they're kind of the last threat. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what happened during the Trump administration, because it was a quantum or an ominous kind of step forward towards wholesale control. And after the leaking of the Vault 7 documents, which exposed how the CIA has hacked our phones, our televisions, even our cars to carry out surveillance, the intelligence community demanded that Julian be extradited to the United States. The Obama administration had not called for Julian's extradition because the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other publications had published all of that material. They had tried to orchestrate a very dirty entanglement where they sought to get someone they put a lot of pressure, by the way, on Chelsea Manning, and to her credit, she refused to bend, but to get someone to implicate Julian in the theft of the documents. And that, of course, would have created a distinction between Julian and WikiLeaks and the publications that ran the same material. And so they finally decided under the Obama administration not to seek the extradition. But then after Volt 7, the CIA was so enraged, they demanded the extradition. And of course, as we know, even discussed the possibility of kidnapping or assassinating Julian. And the Trump administration then called for Julian's extradition to the United States under the Espionage Act. Now, that's an important moment because up until then, the US government had gone after whistleblowers, people who had leaked information. Now they were going after journalists themselves. We know where this is going. We know what the intent is. It is this kind of corporate totalitarianism. When your government monitors you 24 hours a day, you can't use the word liberty. That's the relationship between a master and a slave. The idea is to draw this kind of iron curtain, this iron veil between what is done by the global ruling elites, the billionaire class, and shroud it from any kind of public scrutiny. And the anger at WikiLeaks comes from the fact that this mendacity, this fraud, this corruption, this cynicism, these war crimes were just repeatedly exposed to the public. And that shreds the credibility of the ruling global elites. And that is why they're carrying out such a fierce vendetta against Julian. Where do we go? I, like many people who are critics of empire, critics of corporate capitalism, have been hit with algorithms. That's not speculation. I used to work for a site called TruthDig until we all went on strike to shut it down because the publisher tried to fire Bob Scheer, and then we all got fired, and then the site got shut down. But in the last year that I was there, the IT people did a graph, and the graph showed referrals from impressions. So impressions are, if you went into Google and you typed imperialism, for instance, and I had written something on imperialism recently, then that with any other article on imperialism would come up. So those referrals by impressions dropped from over 700,000 to well below 200,000. I, of course, was pushed out of the mainstream press, not only for this critique, but because I'm a strong supporter of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement in Israel. This alone will get you blacklisted. It is what saw Harvard drive Cornel West out, refusing him tenure, I think largely because of this issue. And so I was offered a show on RT America, which I took. I had covered Eastern Europe. When I wanted to hear Václav Havel, I had to turn on Voice of America because he was blacklisted by the Prague communist government. It didn't mean that Havel, I knew Havel. Havel was a socialist. He didn't support U.S. imperialism, but it was the only platform he had left. And that's essentially where I was. I did a lot of shows. 6 years, I had a show there called On Contact, on a lot of shows on Julian, a lot of shows on the crimes of empire, a lot of shows on critics of capitalism and corporatism. And it was interesting, in 2017, the director of national intelligence, it was Clapper, published a report attacking RT or attacking Russian propaganda. And there were 7 pages in there on RT. And they tipped their hand completely because there was not one example of quote unquote Russian propaganda that angered them. It was the fact that RT was giving a voice to Black Lives Matter activists, anti-fracking activists, third-party activists, critics of empire, critics of militarism, etc. And that's what they wanted to shut down. So with the inception of the war in Ukraine, which I publicly denounced, by the way, although I clearly believe, having been in Eastern Europe, that Russia was baited, I opposed the expansion of NATO, etc. But that doesn't in any way justify preemptive war, which is what Russia did, is what we did in Iraq. The difference being that preemptive war in Iraq was carried out under fabrications and lies. Um, so uh, after RT was shut down, the entire archive of my show was erased from YouTube. There wasn't one show that was on Russia, nor was there one show that violated the supposed guidelines that YouTube imposes. But what we've seen is now this cabal, or this merger of these huge digital monopolies, YouTube, Facebook, etc., with the Democratic Party. They are working in concert to essentially shut down any critics from the left or the right. That's why I opposed removing Trump from social media, because how are we going to cope when we empower these large monopolies with the ability to censor? We don't know anything about them, how their decisions are made, how they work. They, of course, know everything about us. The quid pro quo is that the Democratic Party will not break up the monopolies as long as they serve in concert. So, for instance, when the content of Hunter Biden's laptop was exposed by the New York Post was locked out of its own Twitter account. And then you saw in the press, including, unfortunately, my old employer, the New York Times, describing the information on that laptop as, this is a quote, disinformation. Well, it wasn't disinformation. We know that everything in there was completely correct and completely true. None of it was. And as the rise of this proto-fascist element, not just in the United States, I mean, Marie Le Pen got 41% of the vote, Sweden, Italy, Viktor Orban, all of which are products of the mutations, I believe, of neoliberalism and the most kind of rapacious social inequality since perhaps the reign of the pharaohs. It creates these political distortions, political monstrosities, as any student of Weimar understands. The response is not to adjust the structural, social, political, economic injustices that have given rise to these proto-fascist movements, but to attempt to impose harsher and harsher forms of censorship on critics. And that's precisely what's happening. I wish I had some kind of sunny vision for the future. I don't. We have to keep fighting every way we can to essentially tell the truth, to confront these centers of power, to give a voice to those the rest of the dominant culture is rendered invisible. That's our job. But it's going to become difficult on many levels, including economic levels, the ability that we have to sustain ourselves as journalists. In many ways, it's the fight of our lives. I went to El Salvador because I wanted to fight fascism like Orwell in my own lifetime. I had no idea I'd end up a few decades later fighting it within my own country. These forces are dangerous and frightening. And of course, once in power, will embrace these mechanisms of censorship that have already been created for them. So on every level, I think we have to do all within our power to fight back. That includes mobilizing to protest what's being done to Julian in Belmarsh prison. It's really, at this point, pressure from the streets. I saw that pressure work in Eastern Europe, in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, when night after night, 500,000 people were in Alexanderplatz or Wenceslas Square. And the foot soldiers, the police, are no longer willing to protect a discredited ruling class. That mobilization is imperative, and it has to happen with the free flow of information, which is our job. But we need both. And without both, we're finished. Thank you very much.